Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said today, if Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire will end and the IDF will return to intense fighting until Hamas is finally defeated. And this comes on the back of President Trump threatening to, quote, let hell break out. But what does that actually mean on the ground? CBN's Chris Mitchell joins us from Jerusalem. Chris, shalom, my friend.
Shalom, Raj. Good to be with you.
Well, let me read you a direct quote from the Times of Israel. It says, the IDF says it is further bolstering forces in the southern command after Hamas said it would postpone the release of hostages. The military describes the bolstering of troops as, quote, extensive, and says it includes calling up reservists. So, Chris, is the ceasefire crumbling as we speak, or do you think there's actually a chance that Hamas would release all hostages by Saturday at noon?
Well, it seems doubtful, Raj, but things have changed here in the Middle East so rapidly. Just as an example, back in December, who knew the Bashar Assad regime would fall within just a matter of weeks? But having said that, it seems like Hamas would be reluctant to release all of the hostages. That would actually leave them, in a sense, naked against the IDF and/or the U.S. The hostages are their main bargaining chips, and it has been ever since October 7th, which is why they kidnapped more than 250 Israelis and other nationalities, including Israeli Americans. So if the hostages were all released, I think that would leave Hamas open to the IDF and just a major assault. The IDF has restrained itself in certain areas in Gaza because they knew that hostages were in particular vicinities. So I can see Hamas changing its tune somehow or trying to negotiate something, but releasing them all, I think, seems doubtful.
Okay, let's say it's Saturday at 12:05 and the hostages haven't been released. People are making a lot about this comment that President Trump said, let hell break out. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, it's a great question. And people have been, ever since Trump said this several weeks ago, people have been speculating, what does that look like? You would think it would be a massive bombing campaign against the Hamas inside Gaza. But again, that puts the hostages at risk. And that puts the dilemma that the IDF has been dealing with ever since they went in right after October 7th. So they certainly have the ammunition, they have the firepower to go ahead and do something like that. But all along, they've been trying to protect the hostages as well as Palestinians. People need to remember that Israel has been trying to warn Palestinian civilians to keep out of harm's way. They send them maps, they text them, they make phone calls just to get them out of the battle zone and the combat zone. Hamas, on the other hand, is trying to use their own citizens as human shields. So a massive bombing campaign I don't see, but certainly the IDF is preparing, it seems like, on the southern border to go back into Gaza if Hamas doesn't release all of the hostages by Saturday at noon. So 12:05 here on Saturday. Remains to be seen exactly what's going to be happening if Hamas doesn't exceed to release all, I think, 79 hostages that are remaining dead and alive.
Well, let's follow out Prime Minister Netanyahu's threat. Basically, he's amassing this large number of troops on the border, and let's say they go back in. What would that accomplish? What I mean, it seems like they've been there for basically since October 8th, which they haven't. But at that point, what are you really accomplishing besides just prolonging this thing? Like, what would the goal tangibly be for the IDF to return to all phases of combat inside Gaza?
Well, the goals, I think, Raj, would be the same. The three goals that they set out right after the war began: destroy Hamas militarily, not allow it to rule in Gaza after the war, and release all the hostages. Now, how they do that remains to be seen. They have been going, house to house, neighborhood to neighborhood in Gaza, and the fighting complicated by not only fighting above ground but below ground as well. The IDF has made substantial efforts to destroy the, say, 400 miles of tunnels. We We were in one of those tunnels several months ago, and General Goldfuss, who was the IDF general briefing us, said they really had to learn their military tactics, how to fight above and below ground at the same time. But they were learning.
Mm.
So I would think more of the same, trying to get the Palestinian civilians out of harm's way and back at what they can do to try to defeat Hamas militarily. It's been a long slog, and a lot of IDF soldiers have lost their lives during this time and been wounded. But they would try to finish the job, I believe, Raj.
Well, Chris, let me ask you one final question. Obviously, this is personal to you. You've been inside these Hamas tunnels. You live in Jerusalem. You are very. This is become your life, your profession. But if you look at the YouTube comments, if you look at social media, um, a word's thrown around a lot. And as someone who I can't imagine has more experience and extensive knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground, I feel like it's only fair to allow you to respond. This might be a little editorial, but whatever. I want you to respond, Chris. When people, millennials, Gen Z, they look at the situation and they say Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, what would your response be?
Well, my response would be, first of all, as I said, they're trying to keep civilians out of harm's way. And John Spencer, who's a military historian, say the IDF does more than any other military in history to keep civilians out of harm's way. So if they're doing a genocide, they're doing a very bad job at it. So that's one thing. They try to get civilians out of harm's way. As I said, Hamas does what they can to put their own people in harm's way. In terms of a genocide, they're also putting in humanitarian aid, hundreds of trucks, even more now since the ceasefire deal, to provide food and sustenance for the population. On the other hand, Hamas has systematically been stealing that aid, using it for its own resources, and also selling it to be able to fuel and fund their war against the IDF.
Hmm.
So it has been the tactics of the IDF for decades to make sure that civilians are out of harm's way. And part of the destruction, Raj, I think people need to understand why Gaza is such devastation and destruction there. If you look at it, and when we were there, the briefing that we got is that almost every building, every school, every mosque, every grocery store would have tunnels or weapons in them. And
Hmm.
so they had to systematically destroy what had become the largest terror base in the world. And so that's why you see the devastation and the destruction, because basically almost every building in Gaza had some sort of munitions in it, rockets in it. So that's why Israel had to destroy those weapons and those buildings and those tunnels. So Israel's really not committing a genocide. They don't want to commit a genocide. It looks easy for people on the outside to blame Israel and to accuse Israel, but they're doing anything but.
Wow. Well, as always, Chris, thank you so much for your invaluable insight and information, my friend.
Great to be with you, Raj.